The wagon wheel broke 3 miles outside of Miles City, Montana, and Helena Everett knew with cold certainty that her baby daughter would not survive another night in the wilderness without food. The October wind of 1882 carried the sharp bite of approaching winter across the prairie, and little Rose had been crying for hours, her tiny fists clenched against her mother's empty breast. Helena had lost her milk 2 days after her husband, Thomas, died from a rattlesnake bite near the Yellowstone River crossing. The fever had taken him so quickly that she barely had time to dig his grave before the coyotes came sniffing around their camp. Now she sat beside the broken wagon, 23 years old and completely alone, watching the sun sink toward the distant mountains while her 6-month-old daughter wailed with hunger. She had tried everything. Chewing dried meat until it was soft enough to feed Rose, but the baby refused it and only cried harder. Mixing flour with water to make a thin paste, but Rose had choked and turned blue, terrifying Helena so badly she threw the bowl away and wept until she had no tears left. They had been traveling from Illinois to start fresh in Montana territory, full of dreams about the land Thomas had inherited from his uncle. Now those dreams lay buried in a shallow grave beside a cottonwood tree, marked only with a crude cross Helena had fashioned from broken branches. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass rippling like an ocean under the darkening sky. Helena pulled her shawl tighter around Rose and tried singing a lullaby, but her voice cracked and broke. The baby's cries had grown weaker throughout the day, and that frightened Helena more than the loud wailing. She knew what it meant when babies stopped crying. She had seen it once before, when her sister's infant son had died from scarlet fever back in Springfield. "Please," she whispered to the empty sky. "Please, somebody help us." The sound of hoofbeats made her look up sharply. A rider was approaching from the east, silhouetted against the dying light. Helena's heart hammered in her chest as she scrambled to her feet, clutching Rose against her body. Out here, a lone woman was vulnerable in ways that made her stomach turn. She had heard the stories about what happened to unprotected females on the frontier. The rider came closer, and Helena could make out more details. A tall man on a rangy bay horse, wearing a dusty black hat and a long canvas duster that flapped in the wind. A rifle was strapped to his saddle, and she could see the glint of a revolver at his hip. He slowed his horse to a walk as he neared the wagon, his posture careful and non-threatening. "Evening, madam," he called out when he was still a good distance away. "Looks like you might be having some trouble." Helena tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She nodded instead, swaying slightly on her feet. When was the last time she had eaten? Yesterday morning, maybe. She had given most of their remaining supplies to Thomas during his final hours, trying to keep his strength up, not knowing it was already too late. The man dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. As he came closer, Helena could see his face in the fading light. He looked to be in his late 20s, with dark hair that curled slightly beneath his hat, and a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. His eyes were a striking pale blue, and they held a mixture of concern and wariness as he took in the scene before him. "My name is Wade Crawford," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I work at the Double C Ranch about 5 miles north of Miles City. Are you hurt?" "The baby," Helena managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "She needs food. I cannot feed her." As if to emphasize the point, Rose let out another thin wail. Wade's expression shifted immediately, his eyes moving to the bundle in Helena's arms. He stepped closer, and Helena found herself not pulling away. There was something in his face, a genuine compassion that made her instincts trust him. "How long since she last ate?" he asked. 2 days, maybe longer, My husband died and my milk dried up and I have nothing to give her." The words tumbled out in a rush and Helena felt her knees buckle. Wade caught her elbow, steadying her with a firm but gentle grip. "Sit down before you fall down," he said, guiding her back to the wagon wheel. "Let me think for a minute." He walked a small circle, his hand rubbing his jaw as he considered the situation. Rose continued crying and Helena rocked her automatically, the movement so ingrained she did it without thought. Wade stopped pacing and looked at them both, and Helena saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made. "I am going to ride back to my camp," he said. "It is about a mile from here. I have a nanny goat there that I have been bringing to town to sell. She is fresh and giving milk. I can bring her here and you can feed your baby." Hope flared so sharply in Helena's chest that it hurt. "How long will it take?" 20 minutes if I ride hard." "Can you hold on that long?" Helena nodded, though 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Wade was already moving toward his horse, his movements quick and efficient. He paused with one foot in the stirrup and looked back at her. "What is your name, madam?" "Helena Everett." "Hold on, Mrs. Everett. I will be back before you know it." He swung into the saddle and spurred his horse into a gallop, disappearing into the gathering dusk. Helena watched him go, half convinced she had imagined the entire encounter. But no, she could still see the hoofprints in the dirt, still feel where his hand had steadied her elbow. She looked down at Rose, whose cries had weakened to intermittent whimpers. "Just a little longer, sweet girl," Helena murmured, pressing her lips to the baby's hot forehead. "Just hold on a little longer." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Helena pulled Rose inside the wagon and wrapped them both in a quilt, trying to conserve what little warmth they had. She sang softly, old hymns her mother had taught her, anything to soothe the baby and pass the endless minutes. Her mind kept circling back to Wade Crawford's face, the certainty in his voice when he promised to return. Would he really come back? Or had he simply wanted to escape an uncomfortable situation? But he had said his name, given her specific details about where he worked. Those were not the actions of a man planning to disappear. Helena clung to that hope like a lifeline. True to his word, Wade reappeared within 20 minutes, though it felt like hours to Helena. She heard the hoofbeats and scrambled out of the wagon, her heart in her throat. Wade rode up leading a smaller horse behind him, and tied to that horse was a cream-colored goat with long ears and intelligent eyes. The goat bleated as Wade dismounted, the sound incongruously cheerful in the darkness. "Here we are," Wade said, untying the lead rope. "She is a good milker, gentle as a lamb. Do you know how to milk a goat?" Helena shook her head mutely. Wade nodded as if he had expected that answer. "It is not hard. Let me show you." He produced a tin cup from his saddlebag and led the goat to a flat spot near the wagon. The animal stood placidly as Wade crouched beside her, his long fingers working with practiced ease. Within moments, fresh white milk was streaming into the cup. The sound of it made Helena's eyes sting with tears. Wade filled the cup halfway and stood, bringing it to Helena. "Start with small amounts," he instructed. "Too much at once will make her sick. Just let her sip it slowly." Helena took the cup with shaking hands and dipped her finger into the warm milk. She touched it to Rose's lips, and the baby's mouth immediately latched onto her finger, sucking desperately. Helena felt more tears spill down her cheeks as she carefully fed her daughter, finger by finger full of milk. Rose drank eagerly, her tiny hands grasping at Helena's finger. "That is it," Wade said softly, watching them. "Take your time." It took nearly an hour to get enough milk into Rose to satisfy her. The baby finally fell asleep in Helena's arms, her little belly full for the first time in days. Helena looked up at Wade, who had built a small fire and was heating coffee in a battered pot. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt woefully inadequate for what he had just done. "You saved her life." Wade poured coffee into 2 cups and brought one to Helena. She accepted it gratefully, the warmth seeping into her cold fingers. "What happened to your husband?" Wade asked, settling himself on the ground across the fire from her. Helena told him everything, the words coming easier now that Rose was sleeping peacefully. She explained about Thomas's dream of owning land, the inheritance, the long journey from Illinois, the snake that had hidden in his bedroll, the awful hours watching him sicken and die, the wagon wheel breaking yesterday, leaving her stranded. "I tried to fix it myself," she said, staring into the fire. "But I do not have the right tools, and I am not strong enough to lift the wagon high enough to get the wheel back on." Wade nodded, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "I can fix it in the morning. It is too dark now to do it properly." "You should rest tonight. I will keep watch." "I cannot ask you to do that." "You are not asking, I am offering." His blue eyes met hers across the flames. "You have been through hell, Mrs. Everett. Let somebody help you." There was something in his voice, a gentleness that made Helena's defenses crumble. She realized she was exhausted beyond measure, worn down to nothing by days of grief and fear. The coffee cup trembled in her hands. "The goat," she said suddenly. "You were taking her to town to sell." "I have a little money. I can pay you." Wade shook his head slowly. "She is yours to keep now." The words hung in the air between them, simple and absolute. Helena stared at him, unable to comprehend such generosity from a complete stranger. "I cannot accept that," she protested. "A milking goat is worth good money." "That goat is worth a baby's life," Wade said quietly. "And that is worth more than any amount of money. Keep her, Mrs. Everett. Feed your daughter. That is payment enough for me." Helena felt something crack open in her chest, some tight knot of fear and loneliness that she had been carrying since Thomas died. Fresh tears spilled down her face, and this time she did not try to stop them. She cried for her dead husband, for her terrified journey, for the kindness of this stranger who had appeared like an answer to her desperate prayer. Wade said nothing, just let her weep, his presence steady and solid across the fire. When Helena finally composed herself, Wade had laid out his bedroll on the far side of the wagon, giving her privacy and distance. He had also left a plate of dried beef and biscuits near her, along with a canteen of fresh water. Helena ate mechanically, forcing herself to chew and swallow, knowing she needed strength. Rose slept on, the deep sleep of a satisfied baby. "Where were you headed?" Wade asked from the darkness beyond the wagon. "A place called Cottonwood Creek. My husband's uncle left him a homestead there." "I have the deed papers." "That is about 15 miles northwest of Miles City. Decent land, good water. Are you planning to farm it yourself?" The question made Helena pause. She had not thought that far ahead, had been so focused on simply surviving the next hour, the next day. The idea of working a homestead alone with a baby seemed impossible. "I do not know," she admitted. "I suppose I will have to sell it. I have nobody to help me work the land." Wade was quiet for a long moment. "Miles City is growing fast. Lots of opportunity there for a woman with your situation. There is a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Sullivan. She is always looking for help, and she is good people. You could stay there while you figure things out. You seem to know a lot about Miles City." "I have been working ranches in this territory for 6 years." "You get to know the country and the people." He paused. "Not all of it is kind to women alone, Mrs. Everett. You should be careful who you trust." "I am trusting you," Helena pointed out. "Yes, well, I hope I am proving worthy of that trust." They fell silent after that, and Helena finally allowed herself to lie down with Rose tucked safely beside her. The goat was tied to the wagon wheel, chewing contentedly on the prairie grass. Wade's presence beyond the firelight was somehow comforting rather than threatening. She could hear him moving occasionally, keeping watch as he had promised. For the first time in days, Helena felt safe enough to close her eyes and sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon frying. The sun was just cresting the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and pink. Wade was crouched by the fire, cooking breakfast with the ease of long practice. Rose was awake but quiet, looking around with the calm curiosity of a well-fed baby. Helena sat up, finger combing her tangled hair and trying to look presentable. "Morning," Wade said, glancing over his shoulder. "Figured you could use a hot meal. How did the baby sleep?" "She slept through the entire night. I still cannot believe it." Helena climbed out of the wagon, her muscles stiff from the hard ground. "Thank you again, Mr. Crawford. I do not know how I will ever repay you." "Wade," he corrected. "And like I said, no repayment needed. Come eat something." They shared breakfast in companionable silence, Rose contentedly watching the goat, who had taken to following Wade around like a dog. After they finished eating, Wade examined the broken wagon wheel with a critical eye. "The hub cracked when the wheel came off," he said, running his hand over the damage. "I can lash it together enough to get you to Miles City, but you will need to have a wheelwright repair it properly. Think you can manage that?" "If I can get to town, I can figure out the rest," Helena said, more confidently than she felt. Wade set to work, and Helena watched in fascination as he used leather straps and wooden wedges to stabilize the damaged hub. His movements were efficient and skilled, the work of a man who had spent years fixing things with whatever materials were at hand. It took the better part of 2 hours, but finally, the wheel was back on the wagon and Wade was testing its stability. "That should hold," he said, wiping grease from his hands. "But take it slow and easy. No sudden turns or rough ground if you can help it." Helena hitched their 2 remaining oxen to the wagon while Wade packed up his camp. The goat was tied to the back of the wagon, and Helena had fashioned a little pen inside where the animal could ride comfortably. Rose was secure in her basket, full of goat milk and drowsy in the morning sun. "I will ride with you into Miles City," Wade said as he swung into his saddle. "Make sure you get there safe." "You do not have to do that. You have already done so much." "I know I do not have to," Wade said, his blue eyes steady on hers. "I want to." They set out across the prairie, the wagon creaking along at a slow but steady pace. Wade rode alongside, pointing out landmarks and explaining the country. He showed her where the Tongue River met the Yellowstone, the distant shapes of the Big Horn Mountains to the south. He talked about Miles City, how it had grown up around Fort Keogh and was now a thriving cattle town at the junction of 2 rivers. "It is rough around the edges," he warned. "Lots of cowboys and soldiers, not always on their best behavior, but there are good people there too. Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house is on the respectable side of town. You should be safe there." As they traveled, Helena found herself studying Wade when he was not looking. He sat his horse with the natural grace of someone who had spent more time in the saddle than on the ground. His hands on the reins were strong and capable, scarred from years of hard work. When he caught her looking, he did not make her feel foolish about it, just offered a slight smile that made her heart do an unexpected flutter. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "Your husband has been dead less than a week. You have no business looking at another man." But grief was a strange thing, she was learning. It did not follow rules or timelines. And there was something about Wade Crawford that made her feel alive again, made her remember that she was more than just a widow with a hungry baby. She was a woman, young and capable, with a whole life still ahead of her. Miles City came into view around midday, a sprawl of wooden buildings clustered along the river. Helena could see the fort in the distance, its neat rows of structures a stark contrast to the chaotic growth of the civilian town. Wade guided them through the muddy streets, pointing out the general store, the hotel, the church with its white-painted steeple. People stared as they passed, curious about the strange procession of wagon, goat, and mounted cowboy. Wade stopped in front of a two-story house painted a cheerful yellow, with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. A sign hanging from the porch rail reads Sullivan's boarding house. "Wait here," Wade said, dismounting. He climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened to reveal a plump woman in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked Wade up and down, her expression warming with recognition. "Wade Crawford, as I live and breathe. What brings you to my door, Mrs. Sullivan? I have a favor to ask. This is Mrs. Helena Everett. Her husband died on the trail and she is alone with a baby. She needs a safe place to stay while she gets her bearings. I was hoping you might have a room available, Mrs. Sullivan's gaze shifted to Helena, taking in her worn dress, her pale face, the baby in her arms. Her expression softened immediately. "Of course I have room. Come in, dear, come in. You look half-starved. Wade, help her down from that wagon." Wade lifted Helena down as if she weighed nothing, his hands strong around her waist. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Helena felt something pass between them, some current of connection that made her breath catch. Then he was setting her on the ground and stepping back, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Sullivan bustled around them, giving orders to a young girl who appeared from inside the house. The girl helped carry Helena's few belongings while Mrs. Sullivan led the way to a small but clean room on the second floor. It had a real bed with a quilted coverlet, a rocking chair by the window, and a washstand with a mirror. "The necessary is out back," Mrs. Sullivan said. "Meals are served family style in the dining room, breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, supper at 6. There is a bathhouse next door if you want a proper wash, 10 cents for hot water. I charge $2 a week for the room and board, but we can discuss payment once you have had a chance to rest. That baby looks healthy enough, though. What is her name?" "Rose," Helena said, setting the baby down on the bed. "Mrs. Sullivan, I also have a goat. Mr. Crawford gave her to me for milk. Is there somewhere I can keep her, a goat?" "Well, that is a new one. I suppose she can stay in the shed out back with the chickens. Better than buying milk from the dairy, I suppose. Let me show you where." They went back downstairs, where Wade was waiting with the goat. He had already unhitched the oxen and was arranging for them to be stabled at the livery across the street. Mrs. Sullivan led the way to a small shed behind the house, and Wade tied the goat inside with fresh hay and water. "She is a good milker," he told Helena. "Twice a day, morning and evening. She will give you more than enough for the baby, and you can sell or trade the extra." "I do not know how to thank you," Helena said quietly. They were standing in the shade of the shed, Mrs. Sullivan having tactfully disappeared back into the house. "You have given me so much." Wade shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable with her gratitude. "You would have figured something out. You are a survivor, Mrs. Everett, I can see that." "Helena," she said. "Please call me Helena." His eyes met hers, and that current of connection flowed between them again, stronger this time. Helena saw something in his face, a longing that mirrored what she was feeling. But then he stepped back, putting distance between them. "I should be getting back to the ranch," he said. "Boss will be wondering where I am. You take care of yourself, Helena, and Rose." He turned to leave, and Helena felt a sudden panic at the thought of him riding away. "Will I see you again?" Wade paused, his hand on his horse's reins. When he looked back at her, there was something raw and honest in his expression. "I expect so. Miles City is not that big a town." Then he was mounting his horse and riding away, and Helena was left standing in the yard with an empty feeling in her chest. She watched until he disappeared around the corner, then went back inside to the new room, the new life she was going to have to build from the wreckage of the old one. The first few days at Mrs. Sullivan's boarding house passed in a blur of adjustment. Helena learned the rhythms of the household, the other boarders who came and went. There was Mr. Jennings, an elderly accountant who worked at the bank. Two young school teachers, Miss Porter and Miss Reed, who shared a room and were always correcting each other's grammar. A railroad surveyor named Mr. Thompson, who was only in town for a few weeks. They were all kind to Helena, though she could see the pity in their eyes when they looked at her mourning dress and her baby. Mrs. Sullivan put Helena to work helping in the kitchen, saying it would offset the cost of her room and board. Helena was grateful for the work, for something to do with her hands besides obsess over Wade Crawford and the way he had looked at her in the shed. She kneaded bread dough and scrubbed floors and learned how to render lard, all the while keeping Rose close by in a basket. The goat thrived in the shed, producing more milk than Rose could possibly drink. Helena traded the extra to Mrs. Sullivan in exchange for her keep. At night, alone in her room with Rose sleeping in the drawer she used as a cradle, Helena let herself think about Wade. She remembered his voice, deep and steady. The way his hands had been so gentle when he helped her down from the wagon, the blue of his eyes in the firelight. She knew it was too soon, knew she should still be mourning Thomas properly. But her heart seemed to have its own timeline, its own stubborn insistence on moving forward. On Sunday, Helena put on her best dress and took Rose to church. The little white building was packed with townspeople, ranchers from the surrounding area, soldiers from the fort. Helena found a seat near the back, trying to be inconspicuous. The preacher was a balding man with a booming voice who spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan. Helena listened with half her attention, her eyes scanning the congregation. And there he was, Wade Crawford, sitting 3 rows ahead on the opposite side of the aisle. He wore a clean white shirt and a string tie, his dark hair neatly combed. As if feeling her gaze, he turned his head slightly and their eyes met. Helena's heart jumped. Wade gave her a small nod and she returned it, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. After the service, people milled about outside, socializing in the autumn sunshine. Helena was trying to navigate through the crowd with Rose when a hand touched her elbow. She turned to find Wade standing beside her, his hat in his hands. "Morning, Helena. How are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Mrs. Sullivan has been wonderfully kind." "That sounds like her." Wade looked down at Rose, who was awake and alert in Helena's arms. "She has gotten bigger already. The goat's milk agrees with her. She is thriving." Helena hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I was hoping I might see you again. I wanted to give you something, a token of my gratitude." Wade shook his head. "That is not necessary. Please. I embroidered a handkerchief for you. It is a small thing, but it would make me feel better to give you something." His expression softened. "All right, I suppose I cannot argue with that." They arranged to meet the next day at the general store, where Helena needed to buy some supplies for Rose. Wade tipped his hat to her and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Helena feeling both excited and guilty about the flutter in her stomach. True to his word, Wade was waiting outside the general store when Helena arrived the next afternoon. He helped her carry her purchases back to the boarding house, the two of them walking slowly through the dusty streets. Helena pulled the embroidered handkerchief from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. "It is not much," she said, "but I wanted you to have something." Wade unfolded the white linen square, examining the careful stitches. Helena had embroidered his initials in one corner, surrounded by a delicate pattern of leaves. He looked at it for a long moment, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "It is beautiful. Thank you, Helena." They stood on the front porch of the boarding house, neither wanting to say goodbye. Rose had fallen asleep against Helena's shoulder, her tiny fist clutching a fold of her mother's shawl. Wade reached out and gently touched the baby's dark hair, his expression tender. "She is lucky to have you," he said quietly. "I am the lucky one. If you had not found us, she would have died. We both would have." Wade's blue eyes lifted to meet hers, and Helena saw something burning there, some emotion he was trying hard to keep contained. "I am glad I found you," he said, his voice rough. "More glad than I can say." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then Mrs. Sullivan appeared in the doorway, breaking the spell. "Helena, dear, supper is almost ready. Will Mr. Crawford be joining us?" Wade stepped back quickly, as if caught doing something improper. "No, madam. I need to be getting back to the ranch. Thank you for the invitation, though." He left quickly, and Helena watched him go with a mixture of longing and confusion. What was she doing, developing feelings for another man so soon after her husband's death? What would people think? What would Thomas think? But Thomas was dead, a small voice in her head reminded her, and she was still alive with a baby to raise and a future to figure out. Was it so wrong to want companionship, to want the steady strength she sensed in Wade Crawford? Over the next few weeks, Helena saw Wade regularly. He found reasons to come into town, always stopping by the boarding house to check on her and Rose. They took walks along the river, Wade pointing out the different birds and plants. He taught Helena how to properly care for the goat, how to trim her hooves and check for signs of illness. Slowly, carefully, they became friends, but it was more than friendship, and they both knew it. There was an attraction humming between them, growing stronger with each meeting. Wade was careful never to touch her inappropriately, never to say anything that might compromise her reputation. But Helena could feel the weight of his gaze when he thought she was not looking, could sense the restraint in his posture when they stood close together. One evening, in late November, Wade invited Helena to a dance being held at the town hall. It was a social event to celebrate the end of harvest season, with music and refreshments and half the county in attendance. Helena hesitated, knowing that appearing in public with Wade would fuel gossip, but she was tired of living in fear of what people thought. She was a widow, yes, but she was also a woman with needs and desires, and she desired Wade Crawford with an intensity that sometimes frightened her. Mrs. Sullivan agreed to watch Rose for the evening, and Helena dressed carefully in the one good dress she owned that was not black. It was dark blue wool with black trim, a compromise between mourning and celebration. When Wade arrived to collect her, the look in his eyes made her feel beautiful for the first time in months. The dance was held in a large hall decorated with autumn leaves and corn stalks. A fiddle band played lively music, and the floor was crowded with couples swinging through reels and waltzes. Wade led Helena onto the floor, his hand warm on her waist, and they moved together with surprising grace. He was a good dancer, light on his feet despite his size. "Where did a cowboy learn to dance like this?" Helena asked, slightly breathless as they spun through a waltz. Wade grinned, and the expression transformed his usually serious face. "My mother insisted all her boys learn properly, said it was the mark of a gentleman. You have brothers, 3. All still back in Texas where I grew up. We have not been in the same place for years. You miss them, sometimes. But I like the freedom of the territory, the wide open spaces. Texas was getting too crowded for my taste." They danced several more dances, and Helena found herself laughing more than she had in months. Wade was witty when he relaxed, telling stories about life on the ranch and the various mishaps he had witnessed. Between dances, they drank punch and talked with other townspeople. Helena noticed the speculative looks they received, the whispered conversations. But she found she did not care as much as she thought she would. As the evening drew to a close, Wade walked Helena back to the boarding house through the cold night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, the Milky Way a river of light across the sky. Helena pulled her shawl tighter, and without asking, Wade draped his coat around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and sage and something uniquely him. "Thank you for tonight," Helena said when they reached the porch. "I had forgotten what it felt like to enjoy myself." "You deserve to be happy, Helena. You have been through so much." She looked up at him, at the strong planes of his face illuminated by the porch light. "You make me happy, Wade." "Is that wrong? Is it too soon?" Wade's jaw tightened, and she saw him struggling with some internal battle. "I do not think there are rules about these things. Grief takes its own time, and it does not ask our permission." "I feel guilty," Helena confessed. "Thomas has only been dead 2 months. I should still be in deep mourning. But when I am with you, I forget to be sad. I forget everything except how alive you make me feel." Wade reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused thumb brushing her skin. "I have been fighting this since the moment I saw you beside that broken wagon. I told myself you were grieving, that you needed time, that I had no right to feel what I was feeling. But Helena, I cannot seem to stay away from you." "Then do not," Helena whispered. "Please do not." He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Helena tilted her face up, meeting him halfway. Their lips touched softly at first, a tentative question. Then Wade's hand slid into her hair, and the kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and necessary. Helena clutched at his shirt, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart under her palm. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you," he said, the words rough and honest. "I know it is fast and probably foolish, but there it is. I cannot help it." "I am falling in love with you too," Helena admitted, relief flooding through her at finally saying the words out loud. "I have been for weeks now." Wade kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. When he pulled back, his eyes were bright with emotion. "I want to court you properly. I want to do this right." "We are already doing it right," Helena said. "We are being honest with each other. That is all that matters." From that night forward, Wade became a constant presence in Helena's life. He came to town whenever he could spare time from the ranch, bringing little gifts for Rose and spending hours talking with Helena about everything and nothing. They went on picnics along the Yellowstone River, wrapped in blankets against the November chill. Wade taught Helena how to shoot his revolver, standing behind her with his arms around her, guiding her aim. She taught him how to sing the old hymns she loved, laughing when his deep voice went flat on the high notes, the other boarders at Mrs. Sullivan's had accepted the situation with varying degrees of approval. Mr. Jennings thought it entirely proper for a young widow to remarry quickly. The school teachers were more scandalized, though they kept their opinions mostly to themselves. Mrs. Sullivan was Helena's staunchest ally, declaring that love was love and did not follow society's arbitrary timelines. "Life is short on the frontier," she told Helena one afternoon as they kneaded bread together. "People die from disease, accidents, violence. When you find someone worth loving, you hold on to them with both hands and do not let go. Anyone who judges you for that has never known real hardship." As winter settled over Miles City, Helena finally made a decision about the homestead Thomas had inherited. She could not work the land herself. not with a baby and no experience. So she sold it to a young couple just arrived from Ohio, using the money to establish a small nest egg. It gave her a sense of security, knowing she had something to fall back on if she needed it. Wade had been spending more and more nights in town, sleeping in the hayloft of the livery stable rather than making the long ride back to the ranch in the dark. One snowy evening in December, he appeared at the boarding house with news. "I talked to my boss today," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "Asked if there was any way I could take on work closer to town. Turns out the ranch needs someone to manage their supply runs and livestock sales. It is not glamorous work, but it would mean I could base myself out of Miles City permanently. I could find a room to rent, be near you and Rose." Helena's heart soared. The distance had been hard, never knowing when she would see Wade next, always saying goodbye not knowing when he would return. "Oh, Wade, that is wonderful news. There is more." Wade took her hands in his expression suddenly serious. "Helena, I know we have not been courting for long. I know there are people who will say we are moving too fast, but I do not care about any of that. I love you. I love Rose as if she were my own daughter. I want to build a life with both of you if you will have me." Helena's breath caught. "Are you asking what I think you are asking?" Wade dropped to one knee right there in the boarding house parlor, oblivious to Miss Porter and Miss Reed who were watching from the dining room doorway. He pulled a simple gold band from his pocket. "Helena Everett, will you marry me?" The ring had belonged to Wade's grandmother, he explained later. He had carried it with him for years, waiting for the right woman. The moment he saw Helena beside that broken wagon, holding her hungry baby, something in him had recognized her as the person he had been waiting for. Helena said yes without hesitation, tears streaming down her face. Wade stood and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried simultaneously. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with a bottle of elderberry wine she had been saving for a special occasion, and they toasted to new beginnings. They were married 3 weeks later, just before Christmas, in the little white church where they had first seen each other across the congregation. Helena wore a new dress of gray silk, a compromise between mourning and celebration. Wade wore his best suit and looked so handsome that Helena's heart ached with love for him. Rose attended the ceremony in a tiny lace gown Mrs. Sullivan had sewn, cooing happily through the vows. The wedding was small but cheerful, attended by the boarding house residents and a few of Wade's friends from the ranch. After the ceremony, Mrs. Sullivan hosted a wedding supper at the boarding house, with roasted chicken and mashed potatoes and apple pie for dessert. Someone produced a fiddle, and they danced in the parlor until late in the evening. Wade had rented a small house on the edge of town, a 2-room cabin with a stone fireplace and a tiny porch. It was not much, but it was theirs. He carried Helena over the threshold while she laughed, Rose secure in her basket. The cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a rocking chair Wade had bought specifically for Helena to use when feeding Rose. That night, lying in Wade's arms with Rose sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Helena felt a sense of peace she had not known since before Thomas's death. She had been through fire and emerged on the other side, scarred but stronger. And she had found love again in the most unexpected way, with a cowboy who had appeared like an answer to prayer when she needed him most. "Tell me about your dreams," Wade murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "What do you want for our future?" Helena thought for a moment. "I want Rose to grow up strong and educated. I want us to build a good life together, nothing fancy, just solid and real. I want to wake up next to you every morning and know that I am exactly where I am supposed to be." "That sounds perfect to me." Wade kissed her forehead. I will work hard for us, Helena. I will give you and Rose everything I can. You already have, Helena said, turning to face him in the darkness. You gave us life when we were dying. Everything else is just extra. The winter passed peacefully. Wade settled into his new position, managing supply runs between Miles City and the various ranches in the territory. It kept him busy, but allowed him to come home to Helena and Rose every night. Helena took in sewing to earn extra money, her neat stitches in high demand among the town's ladies. The goat continued to provide milk, and Helena had expanded her small operation, trading milk and butter to several families in town. Rose thrived under their care, growing chubby and happy. She took her first steps in early spring, toddling between Helena and Wade with squeals of delight. Wade doted on her as if she were his own blood, carrying her on his shoulders and teaching her the names of animals and plants. Helena watched them together, her heart swelling with gratitude for this unexpected family they had built. In May, Helena realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. Joy, certainly, at the thought of giving Wade a child of his own, but also anxiety about how Rose might react to a sibling, and fear about childbirth after hearing so many horror stories from other women. When she told Wade, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, whooping with delight. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, as if he could not quite believe it. "Our baby, Helena." "You already have Rose," Helena reminded him gently. "I know, and I love her with everything I have. But this feels different somehow, knowing I was there from the very beginning." Does that make sense? It did make sense, and Helena loved him even more for his honesty. They told Rose she was going to be a big sister, though at barely a year old, she had no idea what that meant. She just clapped her hands and said baby with great enthusiasm, which everyone took as a good sign. The pregnancy was easier than Helena's first, perhaps because she was not traveling in a covered wagon or dealing with the stress of a dangerous journey. She worked through the summer, sewing and caring for Rose while Wade prepared for the new baby. He built a larger cradle, big enough for an infant. He put up shelves in the cabin to hold baby clothes and supplies. He fussed over Helena's health, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavy chores. In early January of 1884, during a howling snowstorm that buried Miles City under 2 feet of snow, Helena gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, but Mrs. Sullivan attended as midwife, her experienced hands guiding the baby into the world. When she placed the squalling infant in Helena's arms, Wade was there beside her, tears streaming down his face. "He is perfect," Wade whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand. "Absolutely perfect." They named him William, after Wade's father. He had Wade's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair, and from the moment he was born, he made his presence known with a pair of healthy lungs. Rose was fascinated by her baby brother, wanting to touch him and kiss him constantly. Helena had to watch carefully to make sure the toddler's exuberant affection did not accidentally smother the infant. Life settled into a new rhythm with 2 children. Helena's days were full of feeding and changing and soothing, with barely a moment to herself. But she had never been happier. Wade was a devoted father, walking the floor with William at night when the baby would not sleep, playing endless games of peek-a-boo with Rose. He had proven to be everything Helena had hoped for in a husband and more. As William grew from infant to baby to toddler, the family thrived. Wade's reputation as a reliable businessman grew, and he was offered a partnership in a new freight company being established in Miles City. It meant longer hours but better pay, and the opportunity to build something lasting for his family. Helena continued her sewing business, which had expanded to include dressmaking and alterations. Women came from miles around for her services, impressed by her skill and fair prices. The small cabin became too cramped for a family of 4, so Wade built an addition, adding 2 more rooms and a proper kitchen. It was still modest by most standards, but it was warm and sturdy, filled with love and laughter. The goat that had started everything lived in a pen in the backyard, still producing milk faithfully. Rose and William were raised on that milk, growing strong and healthy. In 1886, Helena gave birth to twin girls, much to everyone's surprise. Clara and Catherine arrived 2 weeks early, tiny but fierce, with lungs that could wake the whole neighborhood. Wade took one look at his 4 children and declared himself the luckiest man in Montana territory. Helena, exhausted but glowing, had to agree. The family continued to grow and flourish as the years passed. Rose grew into a serious, thoughtful child who loved books and learning. She attended the school in Miles City, taught by Miss Porter, who had become a friend to the family. William was more adventurous, always climbing trees and getting into mischief, keeping Helena constantly on her toes. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in a language only they understood. Wade's freight company prospered, expanding to serve the entire region. He hired additional men and bought more wagons, building a solid business that provided well for his growing family. Helena's sewing business had evolved into a small dress shop, where she employed 2 assistants and served a steady clientele. Money was not abundant, but it was enough, and they wanted for nothing important. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Wade took Helena on a picnic to the spot where he had first found her beside the broken wagon. The prairie grass waved in the summer breeze, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, the same brilliant blue as Wade's eyes. They sat on a blanket while their children played nearby, watching Rose chase butterflies with William while the twins toddled after them. "You ever think about that night?" Wade asked, his arm around Helena's shoulders. "When you were sitting here alone, not knowing if Rose would survive?" "All the time," Helena admitted. "Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and cannot believe how much my life has changed. If you had not come along when you did, I would not be here. None of this would exist. I think about it too. I almost did not stop that night. I was in a hurry to get to town, and I nearly rode right past your camp, but something made me turn back, some instinct I cannot explain." Wade looked at her, his expression serious. "I believe we were meant to find each other, Helena. I believe God or fate or whatever you want to call it put us in each other's path for a reason. I believe that too." Helena leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their children play. "You saved us, Wade, and then you loved us. I will never stop being grateful for that." "You saved me too," Wade said quietly. "I was drifting before I met you, going through the motions of life without real purpose. You and the children gave me a reason to build something lasting, to put down roots. I cannot imagine my life without all of you in it." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching their family. Rose had found a grasshopper and was showing it to William, who wanted to catch it. The twins had discovered a patch of wildflowers and were picking them with great concentration, creating tiny bouquets. "Do you ever miss Thomas?" Wade asked suddenly. It was a question he had never asked before, and Helena took her time answering. "I will always carry him with me," she said carefully. "He was my first love, the father of my daughter. He gave me Rose, and I will always be grateful for that. But I do not mourn him the way I once did. That grief has healed, become part of my history rather than my present. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." Wade kissed her temple. "I am glad he was part of your life because he led you to me. Everything happens for a reason, even the painful things." As the sun began to set, Painting the prairie in shades of gold and orange, they loaded their children into the wagon and headed home. The goat, elderly now but still producing a little milk, bleated a greeting when they arrived. Wade unhitched the horses while Helena got the children ready for bed, the familiar evening routine as comfortable as an old shoe. That night, after all 4 children were finally asleep, Wade and Helena sat on their porch watching the stars emerge. The town was quiet around them, just the occasional sound of horses or distant voices. Wade held Helena's hand, his thumb rubbing absently over her knuckles. "I love you," he said simply. "More every day. I did not know it was possible to love someone this much." "I love you too," Helena replied, squeezing his hand. "You are my answered prayer, Wade Crawford. You appeared when I needed you most, and you have been my rock ever since. I thank God for you every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built a beautiful life together. The prairie wind whispered through the darkness, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, safe and loved and unaware of how precarious their existence had once been. Helena thought back to that desperate night when Rose had cried from hunger, and she had thought all was lost. She remembered Wade riding out of the darkness like a hero from a storybook, bringing the goat that had saved Rose's life. She remembered his words, simple and profound. "She is yours to keep now." Those words had changed everything. The goat had been just the beginning, the catalyst that brought Wade into their lives and kept him there. But it was love that had sealed their fate, love that had grown from gratitude into something deep and lasting. Helena had learned that the heart was capable of healing, of opening again even after devastating loss. She had learned that family could be built as well as born, that love did not follow rules or timelines. As the years continued to pass, the Crawford family remained a fixture in Miles City. Rose grew into a beautiful young woman who became a teacher like her beloved Miss Porter. She married a banker's son and gave Helena her first grandchildren. William followed in his father's footsteps, joining the freight company and eventually taking it over when Wade decided to retire. The twins remained close throughout their lives, both marrying ranchers and settling on neighboring properties outside of town. Wade and Helena grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered the storms of life side by side, supporting each other through illnesses and disappointments and the inevitable losses that come with age. Mrs. Sullivan passed away, leaving her boarding house to Helena, who ran it with the same warmth and practicality the older woman had shown her. The goat eventually died of old age, but by then its legacy was secure, having provided milk for all 4 Crawford children and several of their grandchildren. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Wade surprised Helena with a trip back to the spot where they had met. They were older now, Wade's hair silver at the temples and Helena's face, lined with laugh lines and the marks of a life well lived. But when they stood beside the prairie grass, remembering that desperate night and the miracle that had followed, they felt young again. "I would do it all over again," Wade said, pulling Helena into his arms. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy, as long as it led me back to you." "Me too," Helena whispered, resting her head against his chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Even the painful parts, because they brought me here, to this life with you." They returned to Miles City as the sun was setting, their wagon rattling over the familiar roads. The town had grown significantly since Helena first arrived in 1882, barely clinging to life with a hungry baby in her arms. Now it was a thriving community with schools and churches and businesses, all the trappings of civilization. But at its heart, it was still a frontier town, filled with people who understood hardship and resilience, and the value of helping a neighbor in need. That night, surrounded by their children and grandchildren who had gathered to celebrate their anniversary, Wade stood to give a toast. He raised his glass and looked at Helena with such love in his eyes that her heart still fluttered the way it had when she was 23. "To my wife," Wade said, his voice strong and clear. "You came into my life when I least expected it, broken and desperate and so damn brave it took my breath away. You taught me what real strength looks like, what it means to survive against impossible odds. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up grateful every morning. I love you more than words can say, Helena Crawford. Here is to 25 years together and 25 more to come." Everyone raised their glasses, and Helena felt tears stream down her face. But they were happy tears, tears of joy and gratitude for the incredible gift she had been given. She thought of that scared young widow beside the broken wagon, certain she and her baby were going to die. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that help was coming in the form of a cowboy with kind blue eyes and a goat that would save her daughter's life. But perhaps that was the nature of faith, Helena thought. You could not know how the story would end when you were in the darkest part. You could only hold on and hope and believe that dawn would eventually come. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, dawn arrived in the form of someone who saw you at your worst and loved you anyway, who gave you exactly what you needed and asked for nothing in return. As the celebration continued around her, Helena caught Wade's eye across the crowded room. He smiled at her, that slow, warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. She smiled back, and in that moment, everything they had been through, everything they had built together, all of it was worth it. The prairie wind blew outside, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Inside, the Crawford family laughed and talked and celebrated, bound together by love and blood, and the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. And at the center of it all were Wade and Helena, two people who had found each other against all odds and created something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Years later, when Helena was very old and her time was drawing near, she would tell her great-grandchildren about the night their great-grandfather had ridden out of the darkness to save her and baby Rose. She would tell them about the goat that had given milk when she had none, about Wade's simple words that had changed her life forever. She would tell them that love could be found in the most unexpected places, that second chances were real, that grief did not have to be the end of the story. And then she would close her eyes and remember it all. The feel of Wade's arms around her that first night by the fire, the taste of his first kiss on the boarding house porch, the sound of their children's laughter filling their home. She would remember how it felt to be loved so completely, so absolutely, by a man who had seen her at her lowest and loved her not despite it, but because of it, because her strength and courage had called to something deep within his soul. Wade was still beside her at the end, holding her hand the way he had held it for 53 years. His hair was white now, his face weathered by decades of Montana sun and wind, but his eyes were still that same striking blue. He leaned close and whispered, "I love you, Helena. I will love you forever." "I love you too," Helena whispered back. "Thank you for saving us. Thank you for everything." "Thank you for letting me," Wade replied, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me the greatest life a man could ask for." Helena closed her eyes, at peace, surrounded by the family she and Wade had built together. She thought one last time of that young widow beside the broken wagon, of the cowboy who had appeared like an answered prayer, of the goat that had started it all. She thought of Rose, who had grown into such a fine woman, who had given Helena grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried both Thomas's legacy and Wade's. And then, gently, peacefully, Helena let go and slipped away, knowing she had lived a life full of love and meaning and purpose. Wade held her hand until the very end, his tears falling on their joined fingers, mourning the loss of his beloved wife even as he celebrated the incredible gift of their years together. They buried Helena beside the church where they had married, with half of Miles City in attendance. The service was beautiful, filled with stories and tears and laughter as people remembered the woman who had arrived in town, broken and desperate, and built a legacy of kindness and resilience. Rose spoke, sharing the story of how Wade had saved her and her mother all those years ago, how a simple act of generosity had created ripples that spread through generations. Wade lived another 3 years after Helena's death, those years quieter and lonelier, but still full of love from his children and grandchildren. He spent his time telling stories to the great-grandchildren, passing on the history of the family and the values that had sustained them. And when his time finally came, he went peacefully in his sleep, a smile on his face, dreaming perhaps of the day he would see Helena again. They buried him beside her, their graves marked with a simple stone that read, Wade and Helena Crawford. 2 souls who found each other in the darkness and chose to walk into the light together. And on that stone, at Helena's request, they carved a small image of a goat, a reminder of where it all began, of the gift that had saved a life and changed everything. Future generations would see that carving and wonder at its significance, and the Crawford descendants would tell the story again, keeping it alive through the years. The story of how their great-grandmother's baby had cried from hunger, how their great-grandfather had brought a goat for milk, and how he had said those simple, transformative words, "She is yours to keep now." It was a love story for the ages, born from desperation and kindness, nurtured through hardship and joy, and lasting until the very end. It was proof that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, that help can arrive when you least expect it, and that love, real love, can heal even the deepest wounds and create something beautiful that lasts for generations. The prairie wind still blows across Montana, carrying with it the whispers of those who came before, who struggled and survived and built lives out of nothing but determination and love. And somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of a baby's cry, the bleat of a goat, and the sound of 2 hearts finding each other across the darkness and deciding against all odds to hold on and never let go.